Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Kathy Hanneback.
This is our 50th episode. Thank you to all of you listeners who have made Imagine Otherwise such a success and who are creating such inspiring work. So my guest today is Lakshmi Ramgopal, who is a writer, musician, and historian who divides her time between Northampton, Massachusetts, and Chicago. She received her PhD in classics from the University of Chicago. Lakshmi's public writing covers the occult, ancient history, and South Asian experiences for publications like Jezebel, The Chicago Reader, and Broadly. Lakshmi is also a professional musician, performing ambient electronic music under the moniker Lycanthia. In 2014, she released her debut album, Migration, which incorporates literary motifs, improvisation, and classical South Indian vocal traditions. That album has garnered praise from Noisy, the Chicago Tribune, and more. In addition to speaking and performance engagements at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Yale University, and the Wave Gothic Treffen World Music Festival in Germany, Lakshmi was the recipient of the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome in 2014. She's currently a visiting assistant professor of classics at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and is working on her first book and second album. In our interview, we talk about Lakshmi's musical journey through Indian classic Carnatic music, electronica, and Riot Grrrl, what colonial subjects under the Roman Empire can teach us about contemporary geopolitics, and how Lakshmi curates art exhibits that imagine more just worlds. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you are a musician who focuses on atmosphere and texture, those kind of diffuse qualities that make music what it is, but that are often kind of hard to focus on in and of themselves. And you've often described your musical style as kind of ritual chanting for the electronic age. I'd love to hear about your journey into music and maybe what draws you to this type of music in particular.
Yeah, sure. So I have been involved in performing or writing music and learning music since I was a little kid. I grew up a little bit outside of Boston in a pretty boring town called Andover. And I grew up in a household that was full of music from India since my parents are Indian immigrants. And in addition to being put into flute and violin classes, which was something I wanted to do, my parents also had me learn classical Indian dance and also Carnatic music, and specifically vocal music. Carnatic music is a style of classical music that comes from South India. And I wasn't actually all that interested in learning it when I was a little kid, but I'm very glad that my mom especially pushed me to do it for so long, almost for 10 years, because it really taught me a lot about music in a framework that's different from how a lot of kids in the United States do experience music, and learned a lot about the world that my family is from, and ultimately has really fundamentally influenced my own music because of just how I hear sound, what sounds make sense to me, and I think has ultimately made it more interesting. So that was kind of my introduction to music as a kid, and my parents always had Indian Carnatic music on in the house constantly. When I got to college, I decided to teach myself how to play the guitar, and started a bunch of bands with really good friends who we were all really interested in making like Riot Grrrl music. And that was my first foray into writing my own music and exploring my own ideas instead of singing or performing music that other people had composed, which was the kind of music I had grown up doing as a kid. And over several successive projects with other people that were either guitar-based or electronic-based, I ultimately decided I wanted to work on my own music on my own. So a couple of years ago, in 2013, I started a solo project called Lycanthia, which focuses on the creation of ambient electronic music, and is very heavily based in improvisation and processed vocals, and relies very heavily on the Carnatic music I grew up being trained in. And through this project, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of amazing things like tour Europe when I was living in Italy while I was writing my dissertation, and shoot music videos with really amazing international artists. And as part of the project, released my first EP in 2014 called Migration. And I'm now currently working on this on my second EP, which will be following that up.
Ritual and the politics of voice seem like key themes across your work, and I'm curious if that comes from your earlier history with Carnatic music or if that comes from somewhere else.
And one of the reasons I wasn't that interested in it was partly because I don't have sort of like what's considered a traditionally beautiful voice, even among Indian musicians, and I felt really awkward about that for a long time. And even now, I think I sometimes have hangups about my own voice. Over time, though, I've come to kind of accept that more about myself and come to appreciate especially a lot of the qualities of Carnatic music, particularly the sort of drone qualities of it and the sort of repetitive nature of aspects of songs. And this has really influenced how I think about song structure now and the kinds of sounds I really like. I really enjoy, deep, heavy drones from instruments like the Struthi box or even from the voice. And I think that's kind of where the sort of ritual aspect comes into play, kind of thinking about singing as a kind of ritual for self-soothing or for stirring up different kinds of complicated emotions. I like the sort of repetitive aspect of it, and the sounds, using the sounds that I grew up with kind of really come together for me in creating an environment that's not just one where I entertain people who want to see me perform, but where I perform a set of actions that create for me like a personal sense of stability.
So in addition to being a musician, you're also a writer and a scholar, and you focus in particular on ancient history, Rome, the Roman Empire in particular. What drew you to Rome? What do you find so fascinating about that?
Yeah, so I have a PhD in classics from the University of Chicago, and my specialization is in cultural change in the Roman Empire, and particularly in the provinces of the empire. I've always struggled with this question because I don't have a super exciting answer for it. I've just always been really interested in very old things. And growing up, I would, as a middle schooler, would go to the public library and check out every book on Alexander the Great, for example, just to read and learn about him, or about Boudica, the warrior queen in Roman Britain who resisted the Romans until she committed suicide. And I've just always been fascinated by historical figures, and not just historical figures, but figures from the very ancient past. And I think it's partly because I see some of myself in some of these figures too, just because so many of these stories are about identity and people moving from one place to another and understanding who we are in the different contexts that we find ourselves. And so that has ultimately played into my doctoral research and the research I'm currently working on, which deals with interactions between Roman merchants and non-Roman merchants in different parts of the ancient Mediterranean world, and in particular how those kinds of interactions did or didn't produce cultural change. I think the evidence for that is mostly inscriptions and some literary sources that date to between the 3rd century BCE and 3rd century CE, and they show people moving all over the empire and kind of engaging each other in contexts that seem peaceful, even though Rome was a colonial empire and an empire that was sustained through violence or the threat of violence. And so I think it speaks to a lot of contemporary concerns that we have about colonialism and empire and migration and identity.
What's one of the most surprising things that you found in doing this research?
And I've always been really surprised by how mobile people seem to have been in Western antiquity. I think it's easy to think of people in Western antiquity as kind of stuck in the places that they grew up and never able to go anywhere and meet people unlike themselves, and that we are at the sort of forefront of movement and mobility. And it's true that many people in Western antiquity didn't leave the places that they grew up in. And it's true that now we're able to, communicate with people on the other side of the world within a moment. But even so, there's so much great evidence for people in Western antiquity just, traveling from the African continent to Greece to Britain and back. And it's really incredible just how people were able to get all over the Mediterranean world and sort of engage with people who were completely unlike themselves on a regular, constant basis. And this was just normal for so many more people than one would expect.
Is there something that you wish folks knew a little bit more about ancient history? I know you teach, so you probably run into this with students, right?
Yeah. I think people who study ancient history and people who don't really study it as a career, I wish they were more interested in places other than the city of Rome and Roman Italy. I think it's really easy for us to forget that as an empire, Rome spanned just an incredibly vast region of territory, and there were all kinds of people who lived under Roman power, and so many history books just neglect, Roman Africa, for example, or Rome in, what we call, quote unquote, the East. And I think that neglect really reflects contemporary racism and discrimination, and this sort of like, oh, well, those places aren't places we really need to learn about. And so I wish that was something that would change more in terms of how people who don't study ancient history approach it, and even how people who, write sort of survey books approach it as well.
I'm curious how you see your work combining art, activism, and academia, because these seem like such vibrant fields in your various projects. So I'm curious what draws you to their imbrication.
Yeah, I've just never been the kind of person who's happy doing one thing. I've always been, I think, someone who really appreciates research and writing. And so for me, academia has always been a very natural personality fit. But, it's a very solitary kind of work. And I don't think it's helpful to anybody if academics are siloed and aren't really speaking to people who aren't academics. So I always try to do as much public speaking as possible on my work or related aspects of my work. And it's come to influence my approach to making music as well. So I recently was doing research for a course that I'm going to be teaching this spring called Classics and Colonialism, which examines the reception of the classical tradition in colonial environments and even to some extent post-colonial environments. And I came across a book by a British historian named Antoinette Burton called Dwelling in the Archives, which essentially looks at memoirs written by women in late colonial India and talks about how we need to consider these kinds of texts as archival material, even if they don't deal with the perspective of male revolutionaries in India and aren't the kind of material that is often considered archival material. And in doing that research and then experiencing the loss of my grandmother earlier this year, I realized I really wanted to put together kind of a tribute to her and to the lives of women like her in my family who have lived through and in the wake of colonialism. And so I put together a sound installation called Male about this. And it was very much informed by Antoinette Burton's book. And that's a kind of one example of how my academic interests do collide with my artistic work. I think for me, they're really part of the same spectrum. They're both different ways of creating, and I use different kinds of materials to create those things. And I think for some academics, it can definitely be off-putting because they expect, professors to be a certain way. I'm currently a visiting assistant professor at Trinity College in Hartford, and I'm not, I do sometimes hear like, oh, you don't seem like a professor. And I think that's a really, really good thing that, that there are ways of informing the things that I do that aren't academic, but which are grounded in, a lot of background and research and thoughtfulness.
A lot of your writing, as well as your music, engages with spiritual practices like tarot that have a long history in feminist and femme communities of color, social justice movements more broadly. What draws you to these kinds of practices and their connection to social change?
I think that one really important feature that something like tarot has is that it is a tool for self-empowerment. And partly, I think people misunderstand tarot as like a fortune telling, and it's going to give you like a sort of yes, no answers about, should I call him, or like, should I invest in this thing? And I mean, people do use it for that, and that's okay. But I think one reason a lot of marginalized communities are particularly interested in it, particularly marginalized femme communities is because it actually gives you a lot of agency. So it sort of gives you a lens to think about your life that is different from the way you would normally approach your life, partly because it isn't all that rule bound and isn't, quote unquote, like logical or pragmatic. It's a way of like thinking around and about issues that are happening in your life that you don't have control over. And, you pull a certain set of cards from a tarot deck and they're like, okay, well, think about the problem from this specific angle, as opposed to some other specific angle, or the one that you instinctively feel you need to think about it from. And that really helps, that destabilization really helps you to like kind of come to new insights about your life. And that feels really empowering, especially if you're living in a world where so many structures are designed specifically to prevent you from being the person that you can be and that are preventing you from thriving, which is true for me and a lot of other people I know. And I think, that's one reason I personally make use of tarot, for example. And I think that's one reason that a lot of other marginalized communities have been particularly interested in them. But I think that said, it's easy to think of the press that these practices are getting right now as indicative of a new wave in people's interest in magic. And I don't know how accurate that is. I think communities of color and marginalized communities, for example, slave communities in Haiti and the United States, used magical practices as forms of activism. There's a long history of that practice, even within the United States and in the West, and, definitely predates it as well. And I think it's definitely important for people to remember that this is not a new thing, that oppressed people have been using these practices to empower themselves in different ways for centuries.
So what kind of projects are you working on now? Do you have anything exciting coming up?
I do. The really big project I have coming up is a performance I'm doing at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago on October 21st at 10 in the morning. It's part of their 50th anniversary celebrations, and it's part of a lineup that includes pretty amazing people, including Billy Corgan and Jamila Woods, who's an artist from Chicago, and Lupe Fiasco. And I normally perform alone, but this time for this event, I put together, including myself, a 9-person ensemble that includes a drummer and a violinist and 4 chorus members, as well as 2 movement artists from a group called Burning Orchid. And we've rearranged all of my songs, and we're going to be performing them for an hour to the public outside the museum. And it's going to be really exciting. The performance is ending with some new music from a record I'm currently writing and recording that's inspired by the sound installation I did that I mentioned earlier. And over the course of the hour, we'll be exploring kind of this idea of passage through different femininities, and particularly South Indian femininities, and using a lot of floral symbolism to do that. So there'll be a lot of like flowers and flower petals and garlands. And we're kind of ending it on a very celebratory note, even though my music does tend to be kind of dark and moody. And but we're going to be evoking a lot of visual and sonic elements from traditional Hindu weddings at the very end to kind of kick off the whole weekend of celebrations and bring light to and attention to some of Chicago's amazing artists, in addition to this great institution. And I'm really excited about it. It's definitely one of the hardest projects I've taken on. I usually perform alone or with maybe 1 or 2 other people. And this is like coordinating 9 schedules. And I currently live in Northampton, Massachusetts, and everyone else in the ensemble lives in Chicago. So I'm sort of traveling between the two while I'm juggling a full course load at Trinity. And it's just a lot. And but it's also amazing because the kind of ideas that I'm finding myself coming up with, just when I think I've sort of finished coming up with ideas for like what the chorus is going to sing or how they're going to move during this one song, I have like this whole flood of new ideas, and it's just really exciting to experience. And I'm really growing a lot, I think, because of it as an artist.
So this brings me to my favorite question that I get to ask guests, which kind of gets at the impetus behind all the work that you do. Obviously, this podcast is called Imagine Otherwise, and I get to talk with folks about that vision of a world that they're working towards when they create whatever it is that they create in the universe. So I'll ask you, what kind of world are you working towards when you create your music, when you step in front of a class, when you do these kinds of collaborative projects, when you do your academic research? What kind of world do you want?
I think the world that I am currently working towards and trying to create, at least a microcosm of wherever I am, is one that is more equitable than the world that I'm actually living in. And in all of my classes, no matter what I'm teaching, I find a way to kind of bring this question to the forefront, which is, what is the world that we're studying look like? What is the world that we're in look like? And what happens to the people who are left behind? And I think by focusing on those kinds of questions in the classroom, students really begin to think about how their engagement with the world as citizens of the world matters, and how they can do it in a way that's more productive and positive. And my music, something I'm always trying to do is create opportunities for other artists from marginalized communities. For example, when I curate shows, I'm trying to have an intersectional approach to that. And that's easy to do in some sense, but it's hard to do if you are serious about approaching it from a standpoint that isn't about like filling quotas, for example. And, it's always important to remember that there are people who are more marginalized than oneself. And that can be hard to do, and to kind of live my politics as much as possible and as closely to the letter as I can. I think right now it's really hard to be the people we want to be because the world that we're in and that a lot of us have helped create is designed to prevent that. And I want my music and my scholarship and anything else I do to fight that in any way possible, whether it's by reminding people, okay, we need to think about these other things in our scholarship, or in how we curate a lineup for a show, or if it's by creating moments of healing and peace just through giving people the opportunity to experience my music, and in doing so, have that experience myself.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your vision of imagining otherwise.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, Alexander Sastre, and myself, Kathy Hanneback. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about the fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.